Hello and welcome to Turbo Delphi Demos. I'm Nick Hodges, the Delphi Product Manager, and today we're going to be talking about functions and procedures. Now, in the previous demos that I've done, we've used a single program in a console application, and we've just simply written code here between the begin and end statement. Well, that gets pretty inefficient pretty fast, especially if you want to do things more complex than just write out to the console window. So the Delphi language provides a way to modularize your code, if you will, and that is through the use of procedures and functions. Now, procedures are simply code that gets executed when you call the procedure name. And usually a procedure has a name that describes what it does. In this case, I'll just use the old generic do something. And it each procedure has a block of code between a begin and end statement that defines what the procedure should do. And in this case, again, I'll just do something really simple. I am doing something. Like so. So now if I were to come down into the main block of the component, main block of the application, and just type do something, and if I were to, and then let's put the readlin in there so that the console window will start. I'll save the application here, and now if we were to run this application, you'll notice that the code inside the do something procedure is executed. Pretty slick, pretty easy. So a procedure is a means by which you can create chunks of code that will execute upon calling the procedure. In this way, you can modularize your code. Otherwise, you just would end up with thousands and thousands of lines of code right here in between the main begin end of the project. Now, a function is somewhat similar to a procedure, but instead of just simply executing code, it executes code and returns a value. So for instance, we could have a procedure called say my name, and the function could then simply return a string. Now, functions are declared as like this. You declare that you say function, and you give the function a name, and then it has a return value with a you have a colon at the end, and then the final entry here is the type of the return. It can be any Pascal type at all. It can be a class, a record, anything you declare, atomic types, whatever. In this case, it's a string. The result identifier here is a special word inside the Delphi language that determines what the result will be for the function. That will assign the value to the string, to the return result of the function. The cool thing about result is you can change it during. You can do multiple things. You can use result once it's set. You can use it on the left or the right side of the of an expression. You could, if you wanted to, say result. If you could say, let's see, the length of the result is greater than 10. Then you could also do some work in here. For instance, if you wanted to, you could say, you have a long name. And so basically the result becomes just another local variable, but it must be set before the function returns, or in this case the function would just return an empty string. But functions must have a result clause, a result identifier somewhere in them, returning a result that matches this type. Let's see. So now, if I run this, I could say something along the lines of write lin. Well, actually, let's do it this way. How about this? I could declare a variable called name of type string. Then I could say name gets say my name, which would then return a string. Return a string here and assign it to the variable name. Then you could output that something like that. Like so. Now if this is saved and run, you should see my name is Nick. Ooh, I have a long name because my the name has more than 10 letters in it apparently. So that's what a function is. Now it gets a little more complicated. Procedures can do certain things based upon and vary their output based upon parameters, i.e. pieces of information that can be sent to a procedure, and then the procedure has that information and they can act upon it. So for instance, in this case we might pass in a Boolean parameter which can be given any valid identifier name. Do something big, and that could be, say, a Boolean, right? So now we can say if do something big, then we could say I am doing something big. Otherwise, else we could say I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and then otherwise I could say I am doing something small. So now, based upon this parameter, we can do something big. We can say do something big true. We pass in a value here. Or we could do something and pass in false, which would end up doing something small. Again, compile and run. We should see first I'm doing something big, then I'm doing something small, and then the rest of what we had before. So parameters allow you to pass information to a procedure, and then the procedure can act upon that information. You can have any number of parameters that you like. You can have parameters of any type, and parameters of different types. Each individual parameter of different types needs to be separated by a semicolon. So I could pass in more than one parameter here. So for instance, I could say name plus is, and then come down here, and now I could actually pass in, say, my name, which is the result of a function. It's a string. It's a string function that matches the type here, so I can pass in that, and I can copy this down here as well. And now I can use both parameters in my application. You should see you have a long name, Nick is doing something big. You have a long name, Nick is doing something small, and that's a result of the fact that, say, my name has this "you" have a long name in it all that time. But you can see here that this parameter is being used inside of the procedure. Functions can take parameters as well. And so, for instance, we could have a salutation. We could have a can't type here, of type string, and then the result would be, say, salutation plus my name. And then now when we call say my name, we could pass in this parameter Mr. like so. We could pass in Lord Nick Hodges, or we could just pass in, for instance, if I went to medical school, we could pass in doctor. So now again, we run this, you'll see that those parameters were used. Mr. Lord Nick Hodges, Dr. Nick Hodges, whatever, can vary. So that's the very basics of creating procedures and functions. There's more to it. For instance, you can pass in different types of parameters, constant parameters and variable parameters. We'll cover that probably in a future demo. But for right now, you should know now how to declare and use functions and procedures. Remember, a procedure is just a chunk of code that gets executed whenever the procedure name is called, and a function is a chunk of code that gets executed with the purpose of returning a value. So that's it for today's Delphi demos, Turbo Delphi demos. Thanks again, and see you next time around.